Welcome. We're doing another one. Another video. And I should have done this yesterday. I'll be checking out this From All Sides Battle of Fredericksburg unaired Civil War TV special. The comments have been sort of mixed on their opinions of Ambrose Burnside. Some are correct, some are incorrect. But we'll find out how accurate this Civil War special is. So I'd like for all of you to join me in the laziest form of YouTube creation, the commentary. LionHeart. Hey, this is from my birth year. This music's bussin'.
Battle of Fredericksburg. Historians view it as an awesome display of the power of weapons over antiquated tactics.
I mean, he's not wrong, but the rifled musket was a wincy bit overrated. I feel like the real killer was probably the tactics, in that they were getting so close to each other, firing accurate fire. And when you're so close from each other, the accuracy difference is negligible. It's really just the really inexperienced commanders. Both sides had inexperienced generals, stuff like that, especially during the early years. And then you have things like, which is why you see so many casualties in the early years of the war. And then defenses really contributed to that. Things like digging in later years also contributed greatly to those high casualty numbers, because it also extended the longevity of said battle, or created like small pockets of troops that would be absolutely decimated when assaulting the enemy position.
The cradle of new styles of combat. But for the men on the ground, the Battle of Fredericksburg was one of the most ghastly episodes of human carnage ever on American soil.
By the way, well, yes, that is correct. I'd like to thank LionHeart Filmwork for this. If I get copyrighted, I completely understand. This isn't my video. This is LionHeart Filmwork's video. You should check them out. They're a pretty cool channel. I'll be posting their account in the description as well as this video. I hope you guys check this out for yourself and glean your own opinions from it.
Relive the ordeal of Fredericksburg in an entirely new way. Through state-of-the-art computer animation and unique views from every...
Ah, yes, look at that state-of-the-art animation. That's really at the bleeding edge right there. That's at the bleeding edge of technological development. Damn, that really shocks me how good this animation is.
Every point on the battlefield.
Yes, that topography, that very flat topography with little circles, spheres rising out of the ground. Very stunning. Almost like I'm there.
Now, discover that the truth can only be seen from all sides.
That's a really cool intro.
November 10th, 1862. The second year of the American Civil War is drawing to a bloody close.
The Irish Brigade.
And the Union Army has suffered a string of disastrous defeats. President Abraham Lincoln is furious with his generals and pressures them for a decisive Union victory. he awards command of the Army of the Potomac to inexperienced General Ambrose Burnside.
The real Ambrose Burnside had better facial hair than that man. Up there. In the top box.
Confederate General Robert E. Lee knows the Union is ready to attack.
But Ambrose Burnside's facial hair was straight fire. Let me show you how he looked. He had a very successful political career after the war. Was great friends with Abraham Lincoln and Grant. But look at that impeccable beard. Oh, it's just glorious, isn't it? If you're wondering why his jacket is unbuttoned, because that's where generals would put their hands so they look like Napoleon. It's a style. It's a pretty cool style.
But he doesn't know where.
Where? You sound like a Scooby saying whipped cream, or cool whip.
The stage is now set for one of the most horrific episodes in American military history. General Burnside reluctantly takes his command after Lincoln fires George McClellan.
I'm sure you all remember from my last video that McClellan and Ambrose Burnside were great friends prior to McClellan backstabbing him.
Burnside is uncomfortable with the assignment.
I think Burnside just realized he didn't have the brilliance necessary to be a great commander.
Let's just gloss over the fact that McClellan and Burnside were literally best friends. Or Ambrose Burnside thought they were best friends. Ambrose Burnside actually helped him get his job back. Check out my last video for more information about how the armchair historian is bad at his job. Bad at his job. There we go.
He was a man of moderate intelligence.
I think you need quite some intelligence to be a general, so this is a bit relative. I think this is a little bit of unfair criticism. He wasn't capable of commanding an army, that's for sure, but he was quite, in my opinion, quite a brilliant corps and division commander. And he did, as well as a very good brigade commander as well. See First Bull Run or First Manassas, whether you're a Billy Yank or a Johnny Reb, you say Bull Run or Manassas. Ambrose Burnside, in my opinion, commanded his brigade quite well during the battles of during Bull Run. So it's sort of a case of Peter's Law, I do suppose. I feel like he's a little bit underrated. He is very underrated. I think he's a little bit, slightly underrated. As an army commander, he was definitely better than people like Hooker. Jesus Christ, Hooker was bad. You have Ambrose Burnside, and then you have and then on a whole other level of incompetence, you have Hooker. But I mean, he was bad, yes, but he wasn't that bad. He wasn't that bad. He still could handle things like logistics very well, even at that size, which is really his specialty. Administration and logistics. I think he was pretty smart. A lot smarter than people give him credit for.
Limited experience, and I think he realized that this was a huge responsibility, bigger than any military responsibility that any other American general had ever shouldered before.
Meanwhile, Confederate General Lee analyzes the impact of McClellan's dismissal and struggles to predict the Union's next move.
Lee didn't guess Burnside's battle strategy until right at the tail end of the battle.
He knew quite well that McClellan wasn't relieved due to incompetency. He was relieved due to inactivity. And he knew full well that the next guy, whoever it was going to be, was going to get pressured by Washington to move and move now.
Under intense pressure from President Lincoln to act, General Burnside
looked a lot better than that guy. No offense.
Sets his sights on the Confederate capital at Richmond. To reach the city, he will march his army of more than 100,000 men south from northern Virginia. Along the route, he must take Fredericksburg, a small, unfortified rail and river junction in central Virginia.
Fredericksburg was extremely important because it had a railroad that ran from north to south. It ran from the Potomac River all the way to Richmond. It was a surefire way that the Army could get reinforcements. It could get supplies no matter what the weather was. So it was a perfect way to keep going and driving on to Richmond.
On November 17th, Burnside's army reaches the banks of the Rappahannock River, just 400 feet across from Fredericksburg. But they have no way to get across.
Thanks a lot, Alec. I screwed Ambrose Burnside over for the entire war.
Burnside is irate. A week earlier, he had ordered pontoon bridges to be sent ahead for the crossing.
Pontoon bridges were a low-tech wonder. They were 30-foot-long boats that would be anchored in a river, and then they would be lashed together, and then planks would be laid across them and lashed together, held together with basically boards and ropes. But once built, these were amazingly sturdy devices. You could march large numbers of men across them. You could bring artillery pieces across them. Cavalry could cross them.
But there's been a mix-up in Washington. The pontoon bridges are still days away.
At that point, Burnside has to make a decision. Does he take a risk and try to cross his army over the river without the pontoons, or should he wait and take the safer course and wait for those pontoon bridges to reach him?
Fearing that his army could be cut off from supplies and heavy weapons if they forded the Rappahannock without...
That's a completely fair concern. It really, like Ewell, not taking Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge, there really is no right option here. There's really, because you take massive risk in taking Fredericksburg, or you could play it safe and wait for the pontoons. Whilst hindsight is 2020, you probably should have looked. He probably should have taken the city when he arrived, and even though there are few fords, and the fords that were there were quite small and slim, probably should have still taken the city. But given what information that Burnside had at the time and the risks of both options, we likely would have made the same. Me and the audience, likely would have made the same exact decision and the same conclusion that Burnside came up with.
Bridges. Burnside decides that he and his troops will wait. On the Confederate side of the river, the city of Fredericksburg is virtually defenseless. No one anticipated an attack here, so the town hasn't been fortified. No artillery has been positioned, and only a handful of Confederate troops are stationed in the city. The rebels quickly dispatch a messenger to General Lee's headquarters.
You have to wonder if Burnside actually knew how lightly defended Fredericksburg was.
30 miles away in Orange, Virginia.
30 miles, that's pathetic. 1 second. Alright, I am back. It's a couple hours later. I got a drink. I'm ready to continue.
General Lee's headquarters, 30 miles away in Orange, Virginia.
Burnside made that march in 40. He made a 2-day march in 40. Sorry, I made a 40-mile march in 2 days, actually, to get to the Battle of the Wilderness, where he actually saved Longstreet's corps. Crushed Longstreet's corps, saved Hancock's corps. Very interesting. You should read up on it.
Lee is shocked by the news of the appearance of the Federal Army outside the city.
Again, I recommend William Marvel if you want more information on Burnside or how Ambrose Burnside saved Hancock at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania.
Robert E. Lee was surprised when the Union Army showed up at Fredericksburg. He was completely unprepared for it. His initial impression was that once the Union Army had gotten to Fredericksburg, there was nothing he could do to stop them from crossing the river and taking the city.
Caught out of position, Lee orders elements of his Confederate Army First Corps under General James Longstreet to rush to Fredericksburg to intercept Burnside's advancing army. When he arrives, Longstreet is surprised to find the Union troops haven't crossed the river. So he digs in, fortifies the hills around Fredericksburg, and moves his troops into position. Now, 40,000 Confederate troops occupy a strong position in the heights and a 7-mile ridgeline behind the town, while 100,000 Union troops wait for orders from General Burnside to cross the Rappahannock River. General Lee quickly arrives and sets up his command tent on Telegraph Hill in heights above the town. He waits for Burnside to make the first move. Lee believes the troop buildup across the Rappahannock is merely a diversion. Given his superior defensive position around the town, Lee assumes that Burnside will not strike in Fredericksburg. Meanwhile, across the river, Burnside sets up his headquarters in a commandeered mansion and waits nervously for the pontoon bridges. President Lincoln rushes to Virginia to meet with Burnside. He trusts his general to devise a strategy, as long as he acts fast. Finally, a week later, the disassembled bridges arrive. But having lost the element of surprise, Burnside is paralyzed with indecision. His troops know they've missed their opportunity.
If we had had the pontoons promised when we arrived here, we could have the hills on the other side of the river without the cost of over 50 men.
Zook is very much correct.
Now it will cost at least 10,000, if not more.
Very prophetic.
On December 9th, Ambrose Burnside calls his commanders together and outlines a risky plan. He brashly proposes crossing the river and launching a dual frontal assault into the teeth of the fortified rebel defenses, hoping this will be the last place an attack will be expected.
And Burnside is exactly right on this point. It's pretty brilliant.
His officers disagree.
Nobody in the Army liked the thought of attacking Lee's position at Fredericksburg, but Burnside proceeded with his plan, issued the orders. When he did so, many men in his army were just disgusted by the orders.
Burnside was so incensed by this that he proceeded to lambaste them for their lack of cooperation. He told them that he didn't want their opinions. He just wanted them to obey.
Well, that may sound bad. That may reflect poorly on Burnside. You have to remember, these officers were being openly insubordinate. And these officers were being very openly insubordinate, which is just something that does not stand in the Army. Even during the U.S. Civil War, it was a big, big no-no. And I bet it's a similar case now. So Burnside, in my opinion, was completely in the right for telling his officers off for being insubordinate.
Unmoved by the protests from his officer corps, Burnside sets his plan in motion.
Here's a man, Ambrose Burnside, who is naturally modest, who is naturally timid, and I believe that he may be overcompensating for that when he assumes this incredibly aggressive nature that overtakes him at Fredericksburg.
I expect to be sacrificed tomorrow.
Ambrose Burnside is a very, very aggressive commander. He's not wrong.
Goodbye, old boy. And if tomorrow night finds me dead, Remember me kindly as a soldier who meant to do his whole duty.
Before dawn on December 11th, Union engineers quietly begin to assemble 6 pontoon bridges, struggling in vain to mask the sounds of their work. Within minutes, a messenger arrives at General Lee's headquarters with urgent news. The Yankees are trying to cross. A double cannon shot from the Confederate battery is followed by rebel yells along the banks in Fredericksburg.
This was the first landing under fire in U.S. history.
Confederate riflemen take aim across the river and transform the Union bridge builders into sitting ducks. Before long, blue uniform
The first amphibious landing.
bodies float downriver as the surviving engineers sprint for cover. The crossing is stopped in place. Burnside takes drastic action, directing artillery batteries on Stafford Heights to begin a massive bombardment of Fredericksburg.
The Union Army arrayed over 180 pieces of artillery along Stafford Heights, which up until our point in American history, that was the largest massing of artillery at any one certain location at any point and at any time.
Ambrose Burnside was an artilleryman. It's only one would expect him to draw upon artillery.
The main heavy artillery piece on both sides of the river is the 1857 model Napoleon cannon, a 1-ton smoothbore cannon that can throw a 12-pound shell more than a mile.
Those guns are really cool because they can act as both regular cannons firing round shot and canister, as well as howitzers. So they also can fire explosive shells.
Union batteries rain more than 5,000 shells onto Fredericksburg over the 10-hour barrage.
Barrage was something that many of these men had never even imagined before. It was something that was immense in its fire, it was immense in its noise, it was immense in its destruction.
Yeah, ahead of its time. Because you see this later play out in World War I. The preliminary bombardment before the attack.
Whole blocks of the city of Fredericksburg went up in flames. The soldiers were horrified.
The bombardment was kept up for over an hour, and no tongue or pen can describe the dreadful scene. Tons of iron were hurled against the place. It was appalling and indescribable, a condition which would paralyze the stoutest heart.
Reminds me of World War I.
With Fredericksburg under siege, the few remaining residents flee in horror. Seeing the crumbling town, the Union bridge builders are ordered back to work. They nervously return to the pontoon construction. But hidden in the rubble, tenacious Confederate sharpshooters have ridden out the cannon's hellfire and emerge to exact a lethal payback.
No, you didn't pause the video. It's just a very long pause. It's a very long pause in the documentary. Take this moment to reflect on what you've learned. Like a teacher.
In late 1862, President Abraham Lincoln pushes for a Union victory before the winter. Union General Ambrose Burnside is forced to mount an attack on the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. Confederate General Robert E. Lee monitors the Union troop movements. Burnside's plan is to build a series of 6 pontoon bridges and march his troops across the river and seize the town. The Union soldiers waited more than a week for the pontoon bridges to arrive. Now rebel sharpshooters are tearing apart the engineers trying to assemble the bridges.
They just reused the same shot twice.
But Burnside is determined to push his army across the Rappahannock River and into Fredericksburg, so he orders a risky assault by boat.
This was the very first riverine crossing under fire in America.
Don't trust Frank O'Reilly. Well, Frank O'Reilly is right here. Don't trust anything he says most of the time. I mean, while he is a big advocate for Ambrose Burnside, I do respect that. The means which he achieves it is very. He achieves his goals is very, very dirty. He's been completely discredited in the historical community. He does embellish the facts immensely, and he is manipulative in his writing. So don't trust a word that comes out of this guy's mouth unless I corroborate it.
American military history. No one had ever trained for it or prepared for it.
He is completely right here, though.
Under heavy fire, 2 Union infantry regiments totaling nearly 2,000 men make it across the river, establish a small stronghold along the bank, and begin to push into town. By late afternoon, house-to-house fighting, the first urban combat of the Civil War, is raging.
That was astonishing to everyone involved, to actually fight from house to house, street to street, block by block.
It was a house-to-house fighting, yes. If I don't say anything, then Frank O'Reilly is probably correct. If I do say something, then he's probably wrong. I'm probably discrediting him and his words. But yes, it was brutal house-to-house fighting. Quite brutal, but not as severe as he tries to portray it, I believe.
Neither side prepared for that type of fighting. There was no training in that sort of thing.
There was hardly any training at all.
Rebs opened on us from windows and doors and from behind the houses. We had no choice, and after losing half our company, we made a rush for the houses and broke indoors.
Within hours, the Union engineers managed to complete the first of the pontoon bridges. A full division of 5,000 of Burnside's troops rapidly cross into town. The streets are flooded with bluecoats.
You get them ribs, boy.
Seeing the Union onslaught, the Southerners defending the town rapidly flee.
You see this at Gettysburg, but with the rules reversed. During the first day of Gettysburg. It's like how you see this entire incident reversed at Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg too. Mary's Heights. Which we'll talk more about later.
They quickly join the forces in the fortified Confederate positions, strategically located in the hills that ring the town of Fredericksburg like an amphitheater. Now the last of the pontoon bridges are swiftly completed. The path for a full Union assault has finally been blazed. On the morning of December 12th, the Confederates secure their positions in the hills above Fredericksburg, while 2 of Burnside's 3 grand divisions march across the river, putting nearly 100,000 troops into the town. As they arrive, a mortician hands out business cards to the confident troops.
What a mad lad.
Whomsoever would say to me at the time that anything else but certain victory awaited this army, I would have looked upon him with scorn and contempt. I was not aware that hell personified was so close at hand.
Just wait for the Battle of the Crater where Meade screwed up so badly. Oh. I will reiterate here, as I had done in my last video, the crater was not at all Burnside's fault. He was actually exonerated for it by a military tribunal that wasn't completely stacked with McClellanite officers. It was a little bit of the opposite, but it certainly wasn't as biased. It wasn't nearly as biased as the one that Meade had reviewed the crater. So Burnside was exonerated of all fault by a military tribunal. After the Battle of the Crater. So that was Meade and led the defeat, not Burnside defeat. So this Fredericksburg is his only major defeat that he can share some substantial blame for. Though feels kind of bad saying this, but a lot of the blame rests on his subordinate commanders as well, though he does hold ultimate responsibility as he is the head of the army. But his subordinate commanders certainly do not help at all. It's really terrible subordinates that really cripple Ambrose Burnside during his command of the Army of the Potomac. And throughout his entire career in the Army of the Potomac, terrible subordinates cripple him. Except Antietam. That was McClellan. That was McClellan at his worst. McClellan as best and worst.
From his headquarters on top of Telegraph Hill, Confederate General Robert E. Lee observes the size of the crossing and realizes that these troops represent the main force of Burnside's army. This is no diversion.
I think Robert E. Lee was probably relieved because now he knew what was coming and where it was coming.
He was probably really confused too.
And he was able to consolidate his forces. And I think he knew at that time that what was at hand was going to be a slaughter.
Within Fredericksburg, Union troops have other priorities than battle.
It may have been a slaughter, but if things had gone according to plan, it would have still been an excellent Union victory. But sadly, people like Franklin, General Franklin, who we'll get into later, ensured that Ambrose Burnside could not snatch victory from the jaws of defeat after facing so many obstacles. Like insubordinate commanders, the pontoon bridges, and engineers being fired upon by Confederate sharpshooters, etc., etc.
Small-time pilfering for food and tobacco escalates quickly into full-scale pillaging. Art, books, and furniture are smashed, tossed into the streets, and burned.
This wasn't all that uncommon for the time either, so it's sort of like a different time, isn't it? Like you also see the same things with all across the Napoleonic Wars and throughout basically the entire U.S. Civil War. Even basically throughout the entire U.S. Civil War. And even up to the Russian Civil War in 1819 to 1822. With the exclusion of Pyotr Wrangel, he was basically the only person that did not allow his army to pillage the countryside because he actually understood how to win. Sadly, Wrangel did not take command of the White Army in Crimea until it was way too late. A travesty of the highest order.
The Union soldiers took out their anger and their fear and their frustration on the city of Fredericksburg. They looted and they plundered and they pillaged.
Vandalism reigned supreme. Men who at home were modest and unassuming now seemed to be possessed with an insatiate desire to destroy everything in sight.
I can't necessarily blame them. I mean, they are rebelling, and the Confederates are the ones who are rebelling, are the ones who started and are continuing this entire war.
So it was a very bizarre and very just shameful scene on the part of the Army of the Potomac.
The conduct of our men and officers is atrocious. Their object seems to be to destroy what they can't steal, and to steal all they can.
As Fredericksburg becomes a spoil of war, back across the river, a meeting of Union commanders is held at Burnside's headquarters to firm up the attack plan. After a heated debate, a final strategy is set in motion.
Essentially was a two-pronged frontal assault, which Burnside hoped just by sheer force of numbers would force the Confederates off that ridge.
The first prong of the assault will be an attack on Prospect Hill at the far left of the Union lines. It is seen as an area where the Confederate Army is more vulnerable because the ridges are lower and accessible. General William Franklin is told,
There is a special place in hell for William Franklin.
that his 65,000 men must break through at Prospect Hill against General Stonewall Jackson's 49,000 troops. The attack is only hours away.
I'd like to say something real fast. Ambrose Burnside really was insanely overworked. He was insanely overworked at the time of this battle. He had gone days without sleep before because he was working constantly. Because he refused to delegate tasks to his subordinates, which really crippled him when commanding an army. By that I mean he was basically unable to delegate tasks to other subordinates due to his kind nature. Because he didn't want to burden them. Which really speaks volumes about the kind of person that Ambrose Burnside was, and why I hold him in such high esteem.
The next morning, Stonewall Jackson's Second Corps braces for a massive Union assault. But General Franklin receives a vague written order from Burnside that seems to reverse the order for a large-scale attack on Prospect Hill. It commands him to take one division at least to assault Prospect Hill near Hamilton's Crossing.
Well, I would say anybody with half a brain, this is true by the way, anybody with half a brain would take more than a division, would take their entire corps against Stonewall Jackson. This was right after McClellan was relieved, and McClellan, like Napoleon, absolutely hated his subordinates showing independence, which was the exact opposite of Burnside's command style, so it was really jarring. Burnside really loved to let his subordinates run free and basically do whatever on the battlefield because he trusted them. He trusted them to make the right decisions. It kind of bit him in the butt at Fredericksburg, and especially at places like the Crater. Trusting other people was really screwed over Ambrose Burnside. Just how trusting he was of others.
One division means attacking with just 4,000 men, less than 10% of the troops Franklin has ready to fight.
When General Franklin received the order at 7:30, what he read thoroughly perplexed him. It wasn't what he expected. He thought he was going to be the main attack, and he had 65,000 men ready to use. But the order he received told him to use just a division.
That is a bit wrong. It didn't tell him to just use a division. It told him to use at least a division. So that sets a minimum, but that does not set a maximum.
Franklin has time to send a rider to Burnside for clarification, but decides not to.
Yeah, this is why this is one of the big reasons why Franklin and I call him such an incompetent mess. Who in the right mind would, when they're confused by orders, who in the right mind would ask for clarification? What moron, what brain-dead buffoon wouldn't ask for clarification when given such confusing orders? And I'm certain that Ambrose Burnside would have been very happy to clear up any miscommunications or confusion with likely a grin on his face, because that was just who Ambrose Burnside was as a person.
I think by the morning of December 13th, General Franklin was getting a little bit disgusted with General Burnside.
Well, that's because he and Hooker, you can guess what he's known for. Just on his name alone. He and Hooker thought that Ambrose Burnside was. Well, Hooker was really just hated Ambrose Burnside because he loved to scheme. And he wanted him gone because Ambrose Burnside was in command of the army at that time, and he was scheming to get him removed so that Hooker could be placed in command. And you see this time and time again when Hooker's in the Army of the Potomac. He's also trailed by a lot of hookers, called Hooker's Army. He's trailed, and he really popularized the term hooker. And Franklin was just a humongous McClellanite, like way bigger than Captain Captain Duane, who, if you know about Gettysburg or Antietam, then you know how bad he was. Captain or Major Duane, depends on when you're talking about him. Even Meade, he was way bigger of a McClellanite than even Meade, I'd say. And just like McClellan, he was very incompetent. I'm not sure about his defense, but on the offense, he was abhorrent. He was even terrible at Antietam too. The best Grand Division commander would be Sumner. We all love Sumner. May he rest in peace.
What neither Franklin nor Burnside can know is that at that moment, in the Confederate commander's tent, a debate is raging which may change everything.
There was a meeting of the high command of the Confederate armies. Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson rode up, that morning and basically said, "When do we attack?" Stonewall Jackson was like a pit bull on a chain. This is a man who didn't understand defense. He didn't want to fight a defensive battle. That wasn't manly. Where's the honor in fighting a defensive battle?
Yeah, Jackson's pretty terrible on the defense. That's why I think Longstreet is the better commander overall than Jackson. Jackson is unmatched on offense, but pretty bad at defense.
His mantra was attack, attack, attack.
But Lee is able to quiet his fiery Corps commander's aggression and convinces him to await the Yankees' first move.
I'd say that on the level of aggression, you have Jackson at the top, then Hood below him, then below them would be Ambrose Burnside. But Ambrose Burnside actually knew when to use defense and when to be defensive. And he used that very well. But when he was on the offense, he was extremely aggressive.
Jackson's wait will not be a long one. Just after 10 a.m., Franklin orders General George Meade to lead his division of 3,800 infantry into the field and attack Prospect Hill.
General Meade, the same Meade that commanded at Gettysburg. Ooh, you see the lines crisscrossing.
For most Union troops, the fight is waged only with a single-shot rifle. But guns like the Springfield Model 1842 rifled musket represent a big advance over weapons of the late 18th and early 19th century. Its rifled barrel spins the projectiles on their way out, adding range, accuracy, and killing power.
Okay, I like to say that at the distance these men were fighting, the improvement on accuracy and power was negligible. So the rifled musket is very, very overrated.
When Meade's troops...
And this isn't me saying this. I actually talked to Professor Geld at Gettysburg. He actually wrote a book on Lee's life. He himself said that the range that these guys were fighting at, the improvement in accuracy and power was negligible.
Troops near Confederate lines. They're taken by surprise. There seems to be a hidden Confederate artillery battery. Men and horses fall to the hidden guns, and the advance halts. "500 yards away, 24-year-old Confederate Major John Pelham directs just a single cannon.
Pelham was at a great risk, operating very far in front of his lines, but he handled it brilliantly.
The unexpected presence of our guns so close to them seemed to paralyze them and throw them into disorder. Instead of rushing for us and overwhelming us with their numbers, they were evidently afraid of us, judging no doubt that we had a strong force concealed.
For nearly an hour, Meade's men return fire and call for Union artillery to knock out what they believe to be 4 to 8 guns firing on them. Finally, Pelham runs out of ammunition and is forced to retreat. No longer in Pelham's sights, Meade's men reorganize and prepare to assault Prospect Hill, completely unaware that they are outnumbered 10 to 1.
Give it a minute.
In the opening moments of the Battle of Fredericksburg, the first of the Union's dual assaults meets with stiff resistance. A single hidden Confederate cannon
How stiff?
stops the division sent to probe Prospect Hill. At that moment, 5 miles to the north, Burnside's second prong, under the command of General Edwin Sumner,
Sumner! We all stand Sumner.
is preparing for the attack on Marie's Heights. The approach to the Confederate position offers little cover for the Union troops.
The field outside of the town of Fredericksburg going up to Marie's Heights is roughly about a half a mile.
What they didn't mention was that, at least I believe they didn't mention this, though I may be mistaken, is that during the attack, Franklin was supposed to break through with it in conjunction with Sumner. They would be attacking at the same time. Lee would be forced to weaken either his left or his right, leading to one of the two breaking through. Actually, he would be forced to divert reserves over to the right to defend against Sumner, taking pressure off of Franklin and allowing him to break through easier, which would have likely led to a lot of the Confederate army being encircled and destroyed, dealing a crippling blow to the Confederacy, leaving the road to Richmond quite wide open.
So as soon as they passed out of the protection of the houses and the buildings of the town of Fredericksburg and entered into that open plain.
There's a high risk, high reward. Well, if it had been handled correctly by Franklin, it would have been decently low risk, high reward.
Plain, they're going to be under the fire of the guns.
Though it will have come at an immense cost of life. Because Ambrose Burnside was not blind to the power of Marie's Heights.
Midway across the field, a small canal must be crossed. Then a slight ridge offers the last protective cover before a low stone wall. And finally, a short march to the base of the heights. At 11 a.m., the Gibraltar Brigade, made up of troops led by Brigadier General Nathan Kimball, approaches the lower end of the canal. The attack is launched in wide Napoleonic columns, the standard tactic of the era. Troops march in 2 lines, sometimes over 100 men across, just 1 foot behind the other. The Confederate soldiers, dug into the heights, wait for the impressive lines of Union troops to march into range. Federal troops expect most of the rebel cannon fire to be lobbed from behind the Confederate lines. Instead, Artillery Chief Porter Alexander has devised an innovative new way to position his guns.
He brought them over the hill and put them on the downside and arranged them to repel any potential infantry assault up that hill. General Lee didn't like this. And finally, Porter Alexander says, General Lee, a chicken won't be able to live on that field when we open on it.
Alexander was right. Confederate gun crews shred the Union troops, firing solid shot and explosive shells directly into the advancing waves.
No. During the war, unless I had a very big background, if I had a very good background in artillery, like Ambrose Burnside did, then I would trust my artillery chief quite a lot. Unless I was like Ambrose Burnside or Reynolds, then I would trust my artillery chief.
Once within a few hundred yards, an even more lethal munition awaits. Canister.
When firing from Parrott rifle, which is the rifled Napoleons basically, but better, because there were no rifled Napoleons. It was, I believe it was a Prussian design. Yeah, it's a Prussian design. If you load canister into them, it would rip out all of the rifling, so they had to be re-drilled after the battle. So canister was only a last resort if they got too close, but not when firing from a Napoleon.
Canister is basically a thin tin can, kind of like a coffee can. And inside the coffee can, you're gonna put 27.5-inch golf ball size lead balls. And you'll put that inside your cannon. You're basically turning your cannon into a giant shotgun.
And you reduce them to a fine red mist.
5 miles to the south at Prospect Hill, the second prong of Blue Coat.
Thankfully, they were only really effective at like 300 yards or less.
Is also approaching enemy lines. Having survived Pelham's cannon, George Meade's division is again on the move, advancing across the field toward rebel lines. Like at Marie's Heights,
I'd like to mention this. Nowhere in the order that Ambrose Burnside provided does it state to use a division, a single division. It says to use a division at least, which at least I'm not Franklin, but what I can infer from that order would be to use more than a division at the minimum. You can't use anything less than a division. You have to use a lot of men. If the first assault would have failed with, even if I was Franklin, if the division was stalling, I would send in 2 more, I'd send in my corps. However, given the facts, due to how crucial breaking through was, and Franklin knew this by the way, due to how crucial breaking through on the left was, I probably would have just put in my entire division. Orders be damned. But I'm not Franklin, and I'm just, I'm being a general for my armchair, so take it with a grain of salt.
Confederate artillery crews are dug in and ready. To calculate a deadly kill zone, a lone tree 800 yards out has been measured for the cannons to set their range.
Trees attract lightning.
A raise of the hand as the fatal tree is reached, and the 14 guns let loose at the same instant. From then on, it's load and fire, load and fire.
Why was that shell so close to them? It should be at least 100 feet in the air. It should be about 100 feet in the air, at least 80, for maximum effectiveness.
Load and fire as fast as Sponge and Rammer and Lanyard can do their work.
The brutal rain of shot and shells stalls Meade's advance. Back at Marie's Heights, the Gibraltar Brigade has lost nearly 1/3 of their men before the final crest in the field. But the troops stay in rank and continue forward.
Heroes, the lot of them.
As they clear the final rise and approach the stone wall, one more surprise awaits. Behind the wall, Hundreds of Confederate shooters under General Thomas Cobb load their rifles.
Dude, those were like 6 in the CGI.
They could see the Confederate artillery on top of Marie's Heights and thought that was their target. But as they closed to within about 100 yards of the...
As I clues, take this with a grain of salt. I don't know if this is precisely accurate. I haven't heard much about that. But I do know, after visiting Gettysburg, if you see the enemy, you go straight for it. So if you would see those cannons first, you go straight for those cannons. Normally. At least that's what happened at Gettysburg on all 3 days.
Base of that hill, they were stunned to see an entire line of Confederate infantry stand up from a sunken road and fire into their face. It never dawned on them that there was an entire infantry brigade standing right in front of them.
The sheet of flame emanating from that stone wall stopped the Federals dead in their tracks. Against these thousands of rifles, all neatly protected by the stone wall, there almost was no defense. The Federals had no cover.
The destruction of the Gibraltar Brigade is complete. From the edge of town, the renowned Irish Brigade witnessed the slaughter under the heights.
Ireland, Ireland. Long live the Ireland.
On command, they fix bayonets and march forward.
No free advertising. No free advertising.
Divisions already in the field. Their fortitude is matched by that of the small division back at Prospect Hill, who at the same moment are attempting yet another assault.
At this point of the Battle of Prospect Hill, it's just chaos. All 3 of George Meade's commanders are out of action. One of them's dead, one of them's wounded, and the other one's pinned under a horse and can't get up. And so the men are basically leading themselves.
As Meade's outnumbered troops close on Confederate lines, some of his men cross through an undefended area thought by rebels to be an impassable marsh.
Meade had time and time again requested reinforcements, but Franklin had lost contact with his entire corps just because he was that stupid. And he did not know that of Meade's request for reinforcements, countless requests for reinforcements, until after the battle.
When men are desperate for cover, they go into the woods and they begin to filter up. And much to the surprise of the Confederates, it was not impassable at all.
See, this is what I mean. If Meade had gotten those reinforcements, if Franklin hadn't been so stupid, they would have won. They had gotten past the Confederates, and they would have encircled them and exploited this gap. It would have been Chickamauga, but twice as bad.
When the Union Army hit the swamp and were able to penetrate into the gap of Stonewall Jackson's line, they were pointed straight at Maxcy Gregg.
Confederate Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg's South Carolina Brigade is charged with holding 600 yards of ground behind the swamp. Unaware of Meade's attack, his men sit eating lunch.
When Gregg saw troops coming up the hill, he assumed that they were going to be Confederates, when in reality they were Federals.
Shots crack through the trees. The men run to their guns and fire at the figures spotted in the distance through the woods. Gregg is certain that the men are firing at their own Confederate skirmishers and rides along his lines urgently yelling to cease fire.
By the time he discovered his mistake, it was too late.
A Union
My point.
round catches Maxcy Gregg in the spine. His misjudgment has cost him his life and leaves his troops without a leader. Meade's men rout the Confederate defenders and breach Stonewall Jackson's lines.
My point. It stands, and it stands strong.
With the battlefield in chaos, with nothing being planned, you don't want to use the word miracle, but I can't think of another one.
With just 4,000 men,
I can. Incompetence. Guess you couldn't tell I'm calling Jackson incompetent at defense, because he is. He is very incompetent at defense.
George Meade has penetrated a wall of more than 40,000 Confederate defenders at Prospect Hill. Remarkably, one phase of Burnside's brazen plan has broken through.
I wouldn't exactly call it bold. I would call it. I wouldn't call it brazen so much as bold and risky. Unless that's what brazen means. Hold on, let me check. Oh yeah, I was pretty brazen. But it also was risky.
On Marie's Heights, the Union troops are being slaughtered by Confederate rifles. Rebel General James Longstreet is confident he can hold this position indefinitely. But
And he's not wrong.
surprisingly, at Prospect Hill, on their second attempt of the day, Union General George Meade's troops are able to pierce the formidable defenses.
George Gordon Meade led probably the smallest division in the entire Union Army in that attack against Stonewall Jackson. His success was something that must have startled everyone, not only in the Confederate lines, but also in the Union lines. And his success was a 1 in a million chance.
It's kind of overhyping it, but those odds aren't too far off.
But outnumbered 10-1, Meade cannot hold out for long on his own.
Now, at this point, with Stonewall Jackson's front line on the verge of crumbling, Meade knows that he can take this line. He needs help.
He asked an aide to go find the closest troops available and bring them up.
His plea reaches General David Birney. Shockingly, Birney refuses to send in more troops.
It's not that shocking, seeing how McClellan, Burnside's predecessor, ran the army, but it's still shocking nonetheless.
And instead, what he got was a great big dose of who made you the boss of me. This is a guy who said, I don't work for you. You're a division commander, I'm a division commander. We're in two different corps. I take my orders from somebody else.
Now, George Meade was a man with one of the most ferocious tempers in either army. At this point, he went back to find Birney himself. He proceeded to yell and scream at Birney, chewing him up and down, to the point where a witness said to listen to Meade was enough to make the stones underfoot almost creep.
He's not wrong. He's very correct here.
Trying to get away.
I'm surprised George Gordon Meade didn't pull out a pistol and shoot the guy.
I hate how Frank O'Reilly is very correct here. I suppose this must have been filmed a bit before he became such what he is now. Before he became what he is now.
As Meade rages, he may be the only Federal commander who realizes what history will soon confirm. In one moment of fateful hesitance, all chance at a Union victory has vanished. On top of Prospect Hill, Stonewall Jackson directs two divisions to spearhead the Confederate counterattack and close the fractured defensive line. Soon it's every man for himself. Outgunned and drastically outnumbered, Meade's troops sprint back toward the main Union lines, pursued by thousands of Confederate soldiers. In no time, Meade's men surrender every inch they've gained, leaving hundreds of their dead and wounded in the woods behind them. Their dramatic breakthrough yields little except for unanswered questions about what could have been achieved.
Fills me with sadness.
Now, once Meade broke through, and if Franklin had shown any great initiative and moved up with reinforcements
Or any intelligence.
immediately, the Federals would have been able to consolidate everything that Meade had captured. Had they stayed on the Confederate right flank, there's a good chance they could have made the entire line untenable for Robert.
Fredericksburg is like the one thing that Frank O'Reilly knows. Is like one of the very, very few things that Frank O'Reilly knows quite a bit about. because he was a park ranger there for quite some time.
Robert E. Lee. There was a real chance at Union victory.
Though he does BS a lot, though, later, in his later years, when he loses his hair.
But up the lines at Marie's Heights, there's no time for analysis. The battle still rages. The Irish Brigade, made up of mostly Irish immigrants from New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, is the 5th Brigade sent against the Heights. One of their number, William McCarter from the 116th Pennsylvania Volunteers, describes their advance as it reaches the small ridge in the center of the field.
Every third man had fallen, and along some parts of the line, every second soldier had been killed or wounded. To make matters still worse, we had lost nearly all our officers.
They took instant and overwhelming losses across the board. The bloodbath was terrible. And it was showing that the old form of fighting was quickly becoming a thing of the past.
You see individuals, commanders, as well as common soldiers saying, this does not make sense. This long lines marching up to one another and duking it out.
The Irish Brigade battles to within 50 yards of the sunken road before it is destroyed completely. Survivors run for a shallow ravine that is already choked with hundreds of Union wounded.
It wasn't really a ravine, it was a sunken road, I believe.
545 men from the brigade are lost, joining the thousands of dead and wounded that have already fallen. Those fortunate enough to be carried off the battlefield soon find themselves at one of the dozens of makeshift Union field hospitals.
Fredericksburg was transformed into one vast hospital. Just about every residence, church, civic building that was still standing was converted into a hospital.
That thing that you saw put on that guy's mouth was chloroform. So when people say there wasn't anesthetic during the Civil War, they're wrong. People use chloroform a lot. And it's a pretty good anesthetic when applied properly. But if not, then brain damage. A lot of brain damage.
Ghastly and bloody wounds met the eye in every direction. Some had their eyes shot out. The tongues of some were swollen out of their mouths. Some had their bodies shot through. Others were torn and mangled by shell and shot. And all were crowded wherever there was any space.
I really like to touch where most of these guys are conked out because of the chloroform. And that guy you see holding that man down wasn't actually a surgeon. He was actually a regular. He was a medical orderly whose job it was to, I believe it's either the medical orderly or the assistant surgeon. The medical orderly and the assistant surgeon. The assistant surgeon applied the anesthetic. The medical orderly and both the assistant and the medical orderly would hold down the patient if he woke up during surgery, and the medical orderly would get stuff that the surgeon needs, stuff like water and stuff like that, handing out water and washing bandages and other stuff to the and the assistant surgeon helped with the surgery. So there's a very good chance that guy holding down the soldier isn't actually, or one of the two guys, because you see that little arm poking out. It's a very good chance that one of them isn't even medically qualified.
Top Telegraph Hill, Robert E. Lee grows worried that Burnside's masses of human wave attacks may ultimately break through Longstreet's formidable defensive positions. But Longstreet's confidence in his men is unshakable.
General, if you put every man now on the other side of the Potomac in that field to approach me over the same line and give me plenty of ammunition, I will kill them all before they reach my line.
But as the attacks continued to roll forward one after another, Robert E. Lee started seeing a different aspect of the battlefield that he hadn't encountered before, and that was the destructive power of his own men. To look at the pristine Union legions of the morning come back tattered and ruined and broken and bleeding, that truly affected him, and probably affected him for the rest of his life.
In response to Longstreet's morbid boasts, Lee said, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it." Across the Rappahannock, at Burnside's headquarters, Generals Edwin Sumner and Joseph Hooker pressed the Union commander to end the slaughter.
The conversation between Hooker and Burnside was not at all pleasant. Hooker was a very outspoken man. He didn't like Burnside. Burnside didn't like him.
Outspoken is a very big understatement. He was insubordinate, not outspoken. Look at that glorious facial hair.
And General Hooker made it very clear that Burnside should not make these assaults. Burnside was a somewhat inflexible man, a somewhat stubborn man, and as the going got tough,
He wasn't inflexible, he was a bit stubborn, but he certainly... No, I wouldn't even call him all that stubborn. He was stubborn in a good way, but not overly stubborn. He was persistent. That's what he was. Not stubborn, persistent. And he was very patient.
Burnside simply decided to up the ante.
Generations of historians have spent their lives trying to figure out what in the world was Ambrose Burnside thinking. It's a difficult question to answer. The man is sleep deprived, for one thing. He's probably a little bit delusional.
That's what I said. He had gone days without sleep before. Working. Real workaholic.
The attacks on Marie's Heights would continue. One of Sumner's commanders, General Darius Couch,
So Ambrose Burnside wasn't necessarily himself during the battle because he was so sleep deprived. That may have been, and that was likely what was responsible for his uncharacteristic actions during the battle and his confusing orders to Franklin, though they're a little bit trumped up, aren't they? A little bit overstated. Weren't that confusing.
witnesses the result from an observation post in the courthouse tower.
The whole plain was covered with men, prostrate and dropping, the live men running here and there, and in front closing upon each other, and the wounded coming back. The command seemed to be mixed up. I had never before seen fighting like that. Nothing approaching it in terrible uproar and destruction.
In all, 15 brigades are sent to their destruction before sun sets on the killing fields. Not a single Yankee reaches the sunken road.
Not 30 meters. Though I do still think that assault on Marie's Heights was the right decision. If Franklin had performed his duty properly, like Sumner and as much as I hate to say it, Hooker, or even half as good as they did, Fredericksburg would have been a Union victory, quite decisive, although costly. Probably would have been bloodier than Shiloh and Antietam, but I certainly would have had a lot more casualties than both. But it would have been very decisive.
With nightfall on December 13th, the futile Union attacks on the Confederate strongholds around Fredericksburg finally halt. Thousands of dead, dying, and wounded Union troops lay across the battlefield. For the Confederate troops watching and listening, the night is one that will remain etched in their minds.
If you were a Confederate soldier looking out across that field as the fighting sputtered to an end on December 13th, it would have been a terribly gruesome sight. You would have had hundreds of Union soldiers lying in all attitudes of pain on the ground, some with heads blown off, others with wounds to their arms, some groaning, some trying to crawl to safety.
When night descended upon the bloody field, nearly 1,500 dead soldiers lay in an area of 2 acres in front of our lines. 3 or 4 times as many wounded howled in the darkness, a dismal concert for assistance which could not be rendered, or they perished in the cold from neglect.
Shots and artillery are exchanged wildly in the dark. The wounded use the dead as human shields. Union recovery teams brave the blind volleys to pull their casualties off the field. A half-mile away in his headquarters on Telegraph Hill, Robert E. Lee assesses the situation. Some of his commanders press for a counterattack to finish off the Army of the Potomac. But in spite of having crushed every Union unit sent against him, the Confederate leader is not convinced that the Union Army has abandoned their offensive.
Both Union and Confederate soldiers were under the impression that what had ended on December 13th would almost certainly begin again on December 14th. Nobody was under the impression that this battle was over, least of all General Burnside and Robert E. Lee.
Lee's instincts are correct. Across the river, Burnside is laying out his plan to seize victory from ghastly defeat with a final all-out assault.
But this attack was going to be a little bit different. This time, Burnside planned to attack with his own old 9th Corps, which he's going to mass them into a very compact formation.
Burnside's intention is to create a colossal block of infantry hundreds of men wide and 36 lines deep. It is an idea that is both daring and desperate. In the hope of getting a few hundred men past the stone wall, Burnside is willing to sacrifice thousands more. One man, almost certain to fall, will be the officer leading the charge, Burnside himself.
Yeah, one criticism I actually have about Burnside, shocking, I know. He probably should have made that final assault on the left flank and not the right.
I think Burnside was so distraught by what he had seen on December 13th and felt so guilty about it that this was Burnside's way of trying to end his own life.
That's not out of character for Ambrose Burnside at all, to care so much about his men. He cared so much. Jesus, he cared so much about his men. Every single one of them. His men loved him. And the 9th Corps adored Burnside because he cared so much for the soldiers. He was just overall an amazing person.
Burnside's men are finally able to reason with their commander, and they talk him out of his reckless final maneuver. And thousands are saved from needless slaughter. Dawn on December 14th brings skirmishes and artillery, but no further attack. For the wounded abandoned in front of the stone wall, it also means another day of agony.
These men had bled, they were thirsty, they were crying out for water, and yet nobody could go to help them because to step out onto that no man's ground was essentially to commit suicide. Finally, one soldier couldn't take it any longer.
Richard Kirkland, a 19-year-old Confederate sergeant manning the sunken road, cannot stand the anguish he sees among the Union wounded stretched out in front of him.
He asked for permission to take water out into no man's land and give it to the Union soldiers. His commanders thought that that would be a suicidal mission, but he undertook it anyway.
At the risk of his own life, he leaped over the wall, dodged some bullets until he reached the very first soldier. At that point, he knelt down, gave the man a drink of water out of one of the canteens he was carrying.
The firing halts quickly as exhausted soldiers on both sides watch in awe the bold display of compassion amid the slaughter. A day later, under cover of a blinding rain and sleet, the Union Army completes a miraculous silent retreat across the river they escape undetected, saving the remainder of the Union Army of the Potomac. In Fredericksburg, and in the hospitals and fields outside the town,
one can imagine how difficult managing to scrape together an orderly withdrawal was.
more than 13,000 Union casualties lie wounded or dead. Confederates tally their wounded and dead at 5,300. In spite of their casualties, the rebel troops are exultant. They've dealt the Union Army another grave blow.
They thought they were invincible. They were unbeatable. In the future, one more victory, maybe the Southern Confederacy would be a reality.
Ironically, in victory, Lee misses a chance to deal the Army of the Potomac a mortal blow.
Lee could have damaged the Army much more than he did had he simply shelled the town of Fredericksburg. It was a very small place, packed from end to end with troops, and if Lee had unleashed his artillery on the town on December the 14th, there would have been thousands of more casualties.
Following the Battle of Fredericksburg, President Lincoln downplays the defeat by saying the number of casualties is comparatively low. General Burnside, living up to his own feelings of incompetence, is relieved of his command of the Army of the Potomac.
Not because of Fredericksburg, but because of the following Mud March, which you can't control the weather.
His replacement is General Joseph Hooker, Burnside's rival since their days together at West Point.
And Hooker is much worse than Ambrose Burnside at commanding an army. Whilst Ambrose Burnside might have been quite a brilliant corps commander, in my opinion at least, Hooker has none of the redeeming qualities that Ambrose Burnside has, and very little of the tactical brilliance, of the tactical skill and logistical skill shown by Ambrose Burnside, especially when commanding corps. And even in independent command too. Ambrose Burnside handled independent command extremely well, shockingly well. Just take a look at the West. His stint may have been brief, but that's only because he was so effective that Grant personally selected him and his corps to accompany them in the Overland campaign. And yes, Ambrose Burnside did serve under Grant when Grant took command of the Department of Mississippi, performed extremely well, and did a very, very, very successful campaign in East Tennessee.
Soldiers and generals at Fredericksburg cannot know that the future of warfare has been revealed among the fighting of the past days. Amphibious assaults and grim urban fighting will become deadly fixtures of war in the next century. And the cost of pitting outdated tactics against modern weaponry will be tragically relearned in the trenches of World War I. But what is clear to the men who survived this battle is that many rules of engagement and civility have been smashed forever on this battlefield.
I believe that the Battle of Fredericksburg is the moment at which the American Civil War became notoriously uncivil. I believe that this is the moment that these two armies grew to hate each other, grew to think of each other as barbarians. The period on the end of the Battle of Fredericksburg is Stonewall Jackson looking at the destruction of the town. Somebody asked him, how do we deal with such barbaric acts? Stonewall Jackson said, kill them. Kill them all.
Very in character for Stonewall Jackson.
If you're eager,
I'd like for you guys to I might check out the Battle of Antietam. See how that is. Maybe they have a video on the Burnside expedition. We can finally do that. I've been very excited to do it, but I don't have the skill, a vector to do it. But thank you all for watching. I hope I cleared some misconceptions about the Battle of Fredericksburg up. In conclusion, I'd like to say that Ambrose Burnside, his plan was actually pretty solid plan. Whilst it may have been costly in lives, I think that if his subordinates had just been Franklin, especially, had been not so incompetent. Franklin only really, had not been so incompetent, then Fredericksburg likely would have been a U.S. victory, a Union victory of the highest magnitude. And the U.S. Civil War would have ended in 1863. The Gettysburg Campaign would likely never occurred. So on and so forth. While a huge heap of blame will be placed on Franklin, hopefully, by future historians. Ambrose Burnside does share some of the blame as well, because he was the one who issued confusing orders, although they weren't that confusing, let's be honest. But still, he was the person that issued those orders, and he was in command of the Army of the Potomac at the time. So he has ultimate blame for the defeat. This is a very painful video for me to make, because this is really the only defeat of Ambrose Burnside. However, it must be done. Thank you all for watching. I'll see y'all later.